I used to work at this place that was part of a non-profit organization. One night, the security guard called out sick, and I was the only person available to take his place. Why this building stayed open until 10 p.m., I cannot possibly fathom. By the time it was 7, everybody had already gone home. The building was big and old-fashioned. All I had to do really was sit at a desk and watch the cameras, lock up once 10 p.m. came around, and wait for our truck driver to come and pick up some artwork or something. It was almost 10 p.m. and the truck driver was on his way. That was when the old elevator started to move. It was on the 5th floor, and it began to come downwards. I was freaked out now. No one was supposed to be on the 5th floor. I'd just seen the last person leave 2 hours ago on the cameras. I grabbed my baton and went upstairs to investigate, since the elevator was in motion. I was terrified as I was going up to the 2nd floor. I heard footsteps behind me. It sounded like they were back down in the lobby. I rushed back downstairs, wondering if I'd forgotten to lock the front door, but it was not open. The elevator door opened soon after, and no one was inside. I thought maybe my boss was messing with me, so I started to call out his name whilst walking back up the stairs. No one was on the 2nd floor. I continued up the stairs and heard the elevator begin moving once again. It was on its way back up to the 5th floor. When I got to the 3rd floor, the creepiest thing of all happened. When I got to the 3rd floor, the creepiest of them all, I heard the elevator stop just above me, and I heard footsteps once more. There was nothing on the 4th floor, and when I finally got to the 5th floor, no one was there either. I did notice that someone had placed a creepy statue at the end of the hall, though. I can't believe I had the guts to even go up and get past the 4th floor, honestly. I went back down to the creepy 3rd floor and almost shit my pants at the sight of something moving out of the corner of my eye. No big deal, it's probably just a roach. Keep going and the truck driver will be here soon. Then I can leave. No. I look again and notice the outline of a skinny person with messy hair running by the door of the president's office at the end of the hall. Oh crap. I found some massive balls and picked them up, I guess, because I began to move toward that area. The elevator started moving again, and there were footsteps in the staircase at the same time. I really started to freak out. I wanted to cry right there in the hallway. I had no idea what to do. I ran into the meeting room and hid near the windows, because if I saw somebody skulking about in this building, I was just about ready to jump out them. I heard the elevator doors open on my floor, and someone calling out to me softly, Hey, Jess." I yelled for them to leave me alone. The footsteps got closer to the meeting room. The door opened. I didn't look up because I had my eyes closed. I grabbed the baton and was about to swing at the person when I stopped. It was the truck driver. I was so relieved to see him. He got me all cleaned up and helped me close up as well, then gave me a ride home. I have no idea what was going on that night, but seriously, screw that place. I never worked another security shift there at night again. A couple of years ago, I was sailing on a ship that maneuvered offshore, looking after a pipeline that ran offshore about a half-mile long. As the ship was unhooking from the pipeline, the line that was used to hold the ship to the pipe's connection got wrapped around a person's leg. It sucked him through the rails, and he fell about 30 feet into freezing water. The general alarm sounded for a man overboard, which woke me up at around 5 o'clock. I was all confused, waking up only to find everyone frantically running around on deck. Once I realized this was no drill, I ran to the starboard side. There were 3 life rings in the water, and one was about 3 feet away from the man overboard. He couldn't reach it. He had a work vest on that was keeping him afloat, but I could clearly see that hypothermia had set in already. He was moving slow and weakly calling out for help. At this point, it was clear that he wasn't able to grab the life rings. Half the crew and I ran over to the rescue boat to unhook it, while the other half tried to get him onto the ship some other way. It seemed like it took forever to get the rescue boat down. The hold-down straps were rusted and took a hell of a lot of effort to get off. The cover was all wrapped around the boat, and it was impossible to get off as well. The hoist was the slowest hoist of all time in that moment, which seemed to take 10 minutes. It was all too slow. I was sure this guy was going to die. We finally got into the water. We got 2 guys in the rescue boat, and we started to take off towards him. Of course, everything that can go wrong did, and the engine cut out. Luckily, we were able to get it started up again, but at that point, I ran back to the starboard side. Everyone was yelling and panicking. "Where is he? Do you see him?" one of the mates said. It turned out that somebody had lowered down a ladder, and he'd managed to grab onto it, but his leg was still caught in that line. We couldn't get it free. The line got tugged, and he got sucked underneath the ship. At this point, everyone seemed to go silent. I looked down and saw the man's boot floating up toward the surface. A guy walked up to me and said, "He's gone." After a few nerve-wracking moments, the crew in the rescue boat continued to search anyway and radioed that they'd found him further along, bobbing in the water face down. Still attached to the hoist line, he was unconscious and not breathing. At this point, the rescue crew tried pulling the guy onto the boat. The swell of the sea impacting his chest made him spit up water. The crew radioed back that miraculously he had regained consciousness. The line was removed from his leg, and he was pulled fully into the boat. The boat headed straight to shore, where a beach crew and ambulance were waiting. They got the guy some coats and put them on him. He was conscious enough to understand what was going on, but he could not speak at all. The ambulance took him, where he was sent to the ER for extreme hypothermia and near drowning. The guy's vest ended up saving his life in more ways than one. It kept him afloat and kept him visible. I say kept him visible, because if you blinked in those conditions and he didn't have that vest on, we probably would have never seen him again in that water. Things luckily did not result in his death, but they easily could have due to the temperature of the water. With all that equipment failure and how fast of a reaction time you have to have, it was the scariest thing that ever happened to me while sailing. The look of terror on the guy's face is still with me to this day. That feeling of being absolutely powerless to help, even though he was mere feet away from us. He spent a few days in the hospital after, and miraculously suffered no serious injuries, if you don't count the near-death experience. I was on a cross-country road trip with a colleague. We were driving through West Texas on a major highway in the area. Where we were, even the major highway was pretty desolate though. There had been a truck stop or gas station about every 100 miles, and every single one of them was solitary. No other buildings in sight. There weren't really any towns either. The exits were just places to get to more gas stations to get to the next gas station. It was a pretty late night. We had been driving for about 4 hours. I can usually drive for about 8 before I'm tired, but my friend could only drive for about 4 or 5 hours before she was done. Before it was my turn though, we were getting low on gas, about a quarter of a tank left. When you travel the road often, you learn to fill up when you get the chance, cause you never know what might happen. She was looking out for a gas station as we drove along. It's really corny, but we were talking about fate and destiny and some other weird stuff at the time. That sort of conversation gets me keyed up and worried, so I was trying to change the subject. She took an exit whilst we were talking, and I got out my coffee mug so I could fill it up during my turn for the driving. We pulled up into a typical middle-of-nowhere gas station, just a simple station and the trailer out back. I assumed that was probably where the people who owned this station lived. There was another car parked out front of the doors off to one side as well. We got out still talking and walked up to the double doors, each of us grabbing a door handle. Well, it turned out the door was locked. I turned and looked around to see if there was a sign in some place, be back in 20 minutes or something. I noticed several things in succession. The coffee maker inside was about halfway done brewing a fresh pot of coffee. The monitors that showed the store were visible from the outside. All of them were showing, and there was a splash of bright red on the door in the back of the place. On closer inspection, I suddenly realized I was looking at a huge streak of blood with handprints in it. Every hair on my neck stood up at once. My friend began shaking the door, yelling that we needed to get some gas. I had already turned and started walking away though. "We have to leave now," I said to her. I grabbed her arm and started propelling her back into the car. I now noticed the other car in the lot had no plates on it. It was dingy and had multiple dents. There was also an empty gun rack in the window. I ran into the car, dragging her with me. She seemed to take forever to open her door and get in. The whole time she kept saying we needed some gas, while I tried to explain to her that I'd seen blood. After what seemed like a year, she finally pulled out. When we were backing up, I saw through the windows that the back door of the gas station was now open. We pulled away before I saw anyone come out, thankfully. I was completely freaked out until we were about 20 miles away down the highway. I tried to call the police, but I didn't get a phone signal until we had driven about 40 miles and got to another truck stop. Again, not a town in sight, just a single building on its own, out in the middle of nothingness. I called the cops and they thanked me for the information. I never heard any more about the incident, but to this day I feel like if I hadn't freaked out in that moment, we probably would have met the robbers, or whoever it was in the back room of that place. I wish I'd been able to find out what the hell happened there. It was a station somewhere in the western part of Texas, within about 100 miles or so of the signs for those places on Route 10. I've never been able to find anything about it though. I was in Tesco, the generic wholesale shop that we have here in England. I was just innocently browsing the DVD section on my own. I was looking at the new releases, not paying too much attention. My friend's parents were always on holiday, and she was having a sleepover girls' night at her place. She'd asked me to scope out some scary horror films for us to watch. Whilst looking, I heard someone say to me over my shoulder, "Oh, so you like movies, huh?" I turned around and saw this random guy who looked to be around 70 years old. He had real greasy hair, but what struck me the most was that he was wearing socks and sandals. Yeah, that kinda made me smirk. I looked at him and just said yes, then proceeded to carry on down the aisle. He followed after me and started talking about all the films he'd seen, what I should get, etc. I just replied, "Yeah, okay, whatever." I was reaching the end of the aisle without having found anything I liked. I'm a woman who's 23, by the way, but I must have looked much younger, I guess. I didn't have any makeup on, and I have dark, long brown hair. The guy was still following me, asking me where I was going, if I had a boyfriend too, would I call him if I was alone. That was it for me. I turned around and looked him dead in the eyes. "Piss off, you hillbilly pervert." I walked off further into the shop. I picked up some ice cream and some popcorn and was now going out to my car. I started driving to my friend's place, singing along badly to the radio. I'm not sure how long it had been there, but suddenly I noticed a silver pickup truck taking the same turns as I was. I was only doing around 50 in a 70 area, and they could have easily overtaken me if they wanted to, but they just stayed right behind me. My friend's turn passed me by, but I could take the next turn and double back on myself through the back roads. I didn't indicate, something I regret now, and realized that this was very stupid. I took the other turn and drove back as fast as I could to her house. As I did, I saw the car take the same turn as me. She lives in a cul-de-sac area. I parked my car down the road not far from hers and ran into her garden. She always kept the gate open, and I didn't know how long it would be before she'd open the main door, so I chose the garden instead. I locked the gate behind me and knocked on the back door. After being let in and being called a weirdo and a peeping Tom, I got handed a stern warning. Not a minute later, though, there was a knock on the door. My friend opened it. It was the creepy guy from Tesco with his silver car parked in the middle of the road. He was standing there saying something along the lines that his daughter's car had broken down and she'd run up from her house along this street. He was here to pick her up. Was she there? He described me exactly and what I was wearing. My friend said that no one like that was here and shut the door in his face. She then locked it up tight. I hadn't told them about the creepy guy yet. I had only just gotten there, but she knew there was something off about him right away. We watched through the curtain as he went over to every other house in the cul-de-sac. He would get turned away, then move on to the next one. We later found a piece of paper in a plastic sandwich bag left on my car windshield. It said, "Where did you go? I wasn't finished with you." This happened fall of 2017. My sister Gigi was in high school. My parents took a trip out of country, so I was going to be in charge of my sister temporarily. I lived in my parents' house while doing so. I took her to school, picked her up when she was at her friends' or boyfriends' houses, and picked her up after her church meetings as well. I was told she started going to regular church on Sundays with her boyfriend and his family. I was happy she was getting into it. We grew up Catholic, but didn't often go to church after we moved to the USA. She was also going to another church at night with a friend of hers. I grew up with Sunday Mass, and that's about it, so the thought of spending extra free time and going back to church was quite weird. If she wanted to grow up to be an extra religious person, though, who was I to stop her? On Monday, she went to school and hung out with her boyfriend. I picked her up from the boyfriend's house, no big deal. Tuesday, she went to night church after school with her friend. I was told that she would get a ride home from her friend's mom. She was supposed to be home at 9 p.m., but she came in a little bit late, around 9:40 or so. I asked why they were nearly an hour late, and she said they were preparing for a retreat of some sort that Saturday. Seemed like an alright excuse, and I trusted her, so no big deal. Wednesday through Thursday was mostly normal. One day she went home after school and we hung out. Another day she hung out with some friends. One of these days she was hanging out with her boyfriend and some friends, and she asked me if she could go to church. This would be the second time going to night church in this week. I remember thinking when I was in high school hanging out with friends, it did not cross my mind to spend free time at the church instead. They ended up not going, which relieved me a little bit. At this point, I was starting to get weird vibes from this night church. Friday, the day before the retreat, her plans were to go to church after school and come home at 9 p.m. My plans were to hang out with some friends and be home before then. I was driving home a little late and texted her to not worry her. I received no reply though. I waited for a bit and texted her again. No reply. I called her and there was still no answer. At this point, I was hoping she was already home and for some reason went to bed early. But when I arrived, the house was empty. I kept calling, texting. I started to really panic. Around 10:45, 2 hours after she was supposed to be home, she called me and said they were still at church, preparing for the retreat. She wasn't allowed to have a cell phone turned on. I normally try to be the cool older brother, but I lost it in that moment. Not towards her, but this was getting to the point where it was getting concerning. "I'm coming to get you. Text me the address. I don't care what you're doing. I'm coming to get you right now." I got a text with the address, and I drove to pick her up. I was able to calm down a bit once I'd heard her voice, but I was getting more and more pissed at the same time. Once I got there, some lady was outside waiting for me. She said sorry for the trouble. They were preparing for tomorrow, and that's why Gigi was still there. I said that was all well and fine and all, but I was in charge of her for the week, and our parents wanted her home by 9 p.m. every day, so go and get her right now. She told me that Gigi could not come out right now. The sermon was not over yet. At this point, I really started to lose my patience. You bring her out right now or I'm calling the cops for kidnapping. I'm her legal guardian, and she's under 18. This sparked a real fire under the feet of the lady. She walked inside and invited me in as well. Do you want to come inside? You're welcome. I said to just go and get my sister. The lady walked inside, and a moment later, my sister and the lady emerged. The lady was giving my sister some documents and a shirt, as well as some information about tomorrow's retreat. On the car ride home, I was trying to choose my words very carefully. That was when my sister suddenly turned to me and said, I don't want to go to the retreat tomorrow. Can I stay home and say you aren't letting me go? I said, yeah. Turn me into the bad guy. I don't care. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. It turns out that everything until that night had been normal church things, but tonight they turned it up to 11. There were people yelling, throwing up. They were feeding people something weird that was causing this, and the smoke in the air smelled funny according to my sister. I kept asking her if they fed her anything, but she said no. They weren't supposed to until she went on her first retreat. They said they'd pay for her, making it seem like they were generous. It was supposed to be an initiation, commitment to the place according to my sister's friend, who'd already gone there once. They give you something that makes you sick, representing the evils that are leaving you, and you feel sick for about a week or two. The people there that night were scary and didn't look right in the head. I read all the stuff they handed my sister, all culty stuff. The place looked like a house that was made to look like a small church. I also later found out from my aunt that this church name did not make sense from a Catholic point of view, and they weren't listed or official. When I was a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 at the time, I went shopping with my mom at her beloved store Hobby Lobby. I remember the day very well. I'm in my upper 20s now, and I even still remember the shirt I wore that day. I remember it made me feel pretty, but now that shirt is stained in my mind. My mother took quite a while to shop normally, and I liked looking around myself, so I would not stay too close to her. We lived in Colorado Springs at the time, so it didn't feel unsafe to do so. I was somewhere in the middle of the store, looking at some random things. That was when I looked up and noticed that someone was giving me direct eye contact. Now, I'm very polite and unassuming, so I smiled in a friendly way, and that person smiled back. I didn't really think anything of it. I moved along looking at some other things when I noticed once again that he was fairly close behind me. I decided to go down an aisle near the back of the store to look at some stickers, still not alarmed quite yet. While walking down the aisle, I saw that once again the stranger was following behind me. It was at this point that I realized I was in the corner of the store and it was not too well lit either. I was all along with an older man. I felt the intense need to go back to my mom right now and get away from him as soon as possible. Unfortunately, this encounter was far from over. I scurried back to my mom, who was deep in thought about whatever craft she was doing. I thought at first I would be safe now, and I wanted to inform my mother about what happened. As I looked around, I saw the man staring at me from only a couple of feet away. At this point, I began trying to rush my mom out of the store. I didn't know how to tell her without the man overhearing what I needed so desperately to say. I was so shy and unsure. I wanted to act natural like I wasn't onto him, but obviously looking back I would handle it much differently now. My mother continued to roam the store, all while this man followed us around. One might wonder why my mom hadn't noticed. Yes, it is a little neglectful on her part. She was just that kind of mother in general, always focused on what she wanted to do at the time, not too concerned with the outside world. The classic kid with her face in the book. The man was unwavering in his eye contact and proximity. What was truly terrifying, though, was how brazen he was being. I continued to rush my mom, pleading with her to just hurry up. We ended up at the fabric section of Hobby Lobby. If you've been there, you know they have these giant rolls of fabric. My mother and I stood at one end of the rolls. At this point, the guy knew my mom was not paying much attention, so he stood facing me at the other end. I tried to get away from his gaze by moving to the other aisle between the rolls, but he just followed me. He did this over and over again. I was starting to panic and begged my mom to take us home. We finally started walking away towards the registers. I didn't see him following us at this point. We were checking out, and I continued to look back and forth around for him. Finally, we grabbed up all our things and started to leave. Right before the exit is where I saw him again. He was staring me down. I'll never forget the complete look of disgust and anger on his face. I would not exaggerate by saying that I saw the devil that day. Pure and utter evil intention in his eyes. I knew he was angry because whatever perversion he had on his mind had not been fulfilled. I was truly terrified at this point and started crying and rushing my mom to the car. I told her everything in a hurry while putting the items in. Before we left, I watched for him to make sure he was not following us out. I didn't see him again. I cried for a while to my mother, and she explained to me that I could have told her before, and she would have involved management. As I stated earlier, though, I didn't want him to overhear me, and I was not old enough to really understand. I'd never been taught how to deal with that kind of situation. Looking back, I think he wanted to kidnap me. He was fairly unrelenting. I wonder at times if he had slipped me out back, if I would be alive today. I have a little girl of my own now, and I do not let her out of my sight. I remember once I lost sight of her in the Halloween store for all of 2 seconds and absolutely lost my mind. It's so strange when that sort of thing happens to you, because in the moment, it never feels as serious as it is in hindsight. I'm living in Japan right now, and my family met me in South Korea last month for a vacation. I've lived in Japan for 3 years now, and this was my second time visiting Seoul. The first time, I found myself in a bizarre situation. My family and I were touring a famous palace in Seoul. The grounds were pretty vast, with at least a mile or two of walking required to cover the whole thing. About halfway through our visit, we took a break and sat down on the edge of one of the structures. A German tour group was coming in through the same passage and paused there for a few minutes so the tour guide could explain the history of that particular area. A bunch of German people took seats all around us, along with one Korean guy, who we thought nothing of at the time. After all, we were in Korea. After a couple of minutes, my family and I decided to move on and head to the cafe near the entrance of the palace. The tour group had obviously stayed behind, but one guy got up the same time we did. Yeah, the one Korean guy. We didn't realize until about 5 to 10 minutes outside of that area, but one of my sisters pointed out the guy had been following our path very closely, enough to be very suspicious. By the way, it's worth mentioning we had 7 people in our group. Me, 2 of my sisters, my mom, my dad, my uncle, and my brother-in-law. We definitely had the power and numbers thing going for us. My family is also incredibly confrontational when we need to be so. After my sisters and I noticed something weird was going on, we stopped walking and the man immediately stopped too. We all gave him a very obvious stare down, to which he responded by looking very intently at the ground. Strange, but okay. We decided to carry on, and again this guy decided to follow. By this time, the rest of our family was catching on as well, so we decided to make a stop near one of the gates that led to the main part of the palace to see if he'd stop again. Sure enough, he does. He sat down on the ground trying to make a play as if he were doing his own thing. We gave it another minute or two to look like we were having a conversation before moving along again. You guessed it, the man stood up immediately. He tailed us right to the center of the main palace building, where we stopped again. When we saw he was still following us, this time there was not really anywhere natural to stop and take a seat. Instead, he just kinda stopped in place a couple of feet away from us. At this point, there was no way anyone could deny he was straight up stalking us. My dad and uncle turned right to him. "Hey buddy, is there a reason you're following us?" Maybe the guy couldn't understand much English, but I think the sentiment was probably very obvious. The guy didn't even try to respond, wouldn't even make eye contact with them. He was just silent, staring kind of dead-eyed at the ground. My sisters and brother-in-law and I decided at this point that we needed to find someone who worked there. There was nothing inherently threatening about this guy, but something about him was very eerie. That's beside the fact that he'd been stalking us overtly for over 20 minutes at this point. There were no guards or staff in the immediate area, so we all picked up the pace. The guy, of course, picked up the pace right behind us. We headed over to the cafe once more. My brother and I got there first and found a staff member at the counter. We told her what was going on, and she seemed to understand immediately. She went to get her supervisor from the back. By the time the staff member and her supervisor came back, the guy was now in the cafe with us. I pointed him out to the two staff members. That's him. The guy again didn't make eye contact whatsoever, but obviously the jig was up. He power-walked his way out of the cafe and back onto the grounds. The staff member followed him out and talked to my sister and mom to let them know that if we had any more problems with this guy, to let someone know immediately. It ends kind of anticlimactically, but that's the last we saw of him. Thankfully, the staff were quick to react. With how they acted familiar with him, it kinda made me wonder if this guy had a habit of stalking tourists on the palace grounds, or if this was a regular thing perhaps. We realized after the fact that he must have been following the German tour group beforehand. Maybe he thought we were also a group he could blend into, but while 7 people is definitely a large number, it's not large enough to go unnoticed, especially when we were all a single family. Obviously, we were going to question the presence of a new member. In the end, my uncle and I kind of assumed he was probably just trying to be a perv, trying to get close to an exotic foreigner. I've been stalked in Japan in similar ways before, and my uncle who lives in Asia said similar things happen to women where he lives, but never in a group setting like this. I guess we'll never really know the man's true intentions, but I'm glad we'll never cross paths with him again. This particular story takes place over the span of a year. At the time, I was probably about 8 or 9 years old, living with my mom in a small apartment. My grandmother lived in the apartment below ours. We lived in the middle of a not-so-great town, but I loved being outdoors. I had a lot of older male cousins who lived with my grandmother on and off, and they would come out to keep an eye on me for the most part, while my mom was busy. I don't remember a whole lot of the details, but I think it was sometime during summertime. I went next door to my cousin Leia's house to play. They let us out to play alone for some reason, which I wasn't technically allowed to do, but I figured that I wasn't technically home and that was a home rule. While we were in the alley behind our apartments, an older boy, probably about 15 to 16 years old, stumbled right up to us. Even now, I remember the immense smell of alcohol that radiated off of him. I froze in my spot. The teenager started to wobble back and forth, and began screaming in my face. "Where is my money? I told you I needed my money." This guy was screaming at a child some nonsense about borrowed money. I was absolutely terrified, locked into one spot. I was crying. Leia came to her senses first and yanked me away by the arm. We took off towards my grandma's house, which was much safer than her own, since there wasn't really much supervision on her parents' end. The whole time, the boy just stood and stared at us as we ran off. We tumbled in through the back door, crying and telling our entire family. My cousins decided to scope out the area. The kid was not found, and I didn't give the best description in the first place, being young and terrified. My mom even took me part way up the alley where we had suspected he came from, but he was either hiding or had left already. They were unable to identify him. Leia ended up spending the night at our house. Cut to bedtime. We were in the bathroom brushing our teeth and goofing off. We had a tiny bathroom, so the toilet, sink, and window were pretty much crammed into one corner. Suddenly, there was someone screaming in my backyard. Because of the town and area I grew up in, we assumed it was a fight between my neighbors and my cousins or something, or maybe just between my cousins themselves. Both happen pretty frequently. Being the little gossips we were, we turned straight to the window and settled ourselves in to look. Only it wasn't any of them. It was the drunk teenager from earlier. He was waving something in his hand, still screaming about the non-existent borrowed money. When light finally hit the object he had been brandishing, Leia screamed. He had a gun. Immediately, we dropped to the ground, screaming and crying, unable to form coherent sentences. My mom swooped in and shut the blinds, and ushered us down to my grandma's, where everybody erupted into chaos. The whole night was spent giving statements to the police, calling uncles, and generally trying to calm Leia and I down. We were in absolute hysterics. The guy was never found, and life was fairly normal after. My teachers and principal were informed of the situation when school started beforehand, but nothing prepared me for the day mid-4th grade year when I walked out of elementary school to find this boy and his friends sitting across the street. They weren't technically on school grounds. I tried to justify it. Maybe he had little siblings, or maybe he was just hanging out, but I knew in my heart he was waiting for me. I tried to walk home, but as soon as I would walk in one direction, he and the group of teenagers would match it from across the street. Till I shifted directions again, they would follow suit. Not even a block from school, I made the executive decision to bolt back the way I came and tell a teacher. All hell broke loose again. More police came. The kid was smart though. When I ran, he'd taken off as well, and he was again not found. My mom started picking me up and dropping me off to school after that, so things quieted down a bit. There were still times, though, when I'd be looking out a window alone, when I would see him standing across the street, just watching me. The last incident, I never even connected to this situation until years later. He had stopped showing up at my school almost as abruptly as he'd started. I eventually begged, pleaded, argued, and cried enough for my mom to start letting me walk home with Leia again. In hindsight, that was a terrible idea, but I was a really spoiled kid. One afternoon, I split off from the group of kids that Leia and I had been walking with and headed towards the apartment. Because it was an apartment building, the entrance was set up kind of odd. The first door you entered basically just led to a second door, which then took you to a hallway, where directly to the right was my grandma's apartment door, and straight ahead was my mom's. When I approached the entrance, I noticed the first door was already open. Okay, whatever, it's not that unusual for my cousins to have left it open. I stepped in, took 2 steps forward, and went to open the second door. This door was open as well. Now that was weird. I didn't know why at the time, but my grandmother used to be adamant about shutting that door because my older cousins smoke weed and she didn't want the neighbors to smell it and call the cops on them. I ignored it and continued walking down the hallway. I reached my apartment door to find it standing wide open. My instincts finally kicked in, and I bolted. Nobody was at my grandmother's house at the time, so I never got to go up and check the apartment. No signs of forced entry, nothing being stolen, nothing even rummaged through. I can't prove it was him. Hell, we didn't even think it was an option back then because he'd finally left me alone. Only my mother and myself had the keys though, and if it had been my cousins breaking in, they would have stolen something, anything of value to feed their addictions. The door had been closed and locked up to the point of my grandmother leaving earlier, so it was not an accident, and it was not a forgot to lock the door scenario.